which I make it stay. Make it strong. From barriers to breakthrough, we stand with pride and birth. Sedulous collective, we by your side. Always.
From Leading Roots, we have Dr. Hanna Akalu, participatory researcher and co-convener of the African Diaspora Postgraduate Seminars. Very thought-provoking, and I actually really can't wait to. I'm going to have to wait until the end because Dr. Hanna's speaking last. Not another hijab question, participation fatigue in research. I promise you this is going to be very interesting, and we're really grateful that you're here.
Yes, please. Thank you.
See the screen. You can come up to the screen if you want.
Shall I?
Yeah.
A bit cold. So, another introduction. So the title of my talk today is not another hijab question, and okay, here it is. Thank you. Okay, I've got the next slide. So to briefly introduce myself again. Firstly, good evening, everybody. Thank you to Sedulous for inviting me to be here. How are you all doing? Good. Good. Yeah. My name is Hanna, and alongside working at Leading Roots, I also work at the University of Reading, and I work as a participatory training and development manager, which means I essentially train researchers and students in how to do participatory action research or participatory research. And I've been doing that for just over a year. I'm also a community psychologist, and my background is in psychology, and I'm a past scholar. So my work sits at the intersection of community self-empowerment, racial justice, and ethical research practices. And I did my PhD using PAR and photo voice, which is a visual method. I'm talking really fast, aren't I? I'm going to slow down a bit. Yeah, my daughter said that to me. You're talking fast. She's sitting right here. Is anybody here from Glasgow Caledonian University? Studied there or student there? No? Good, because I had the worst time there. I had 5 years of hell doing my PhD there, and as much as I'm glad that I'm out of there, I'm sure they're happy to see the back of me because, I was a student activist, and when I call student activist, they wanted me gone. Got my PhD there, and that's where my sort of love for participatory research and working with communities to self-empower and to mobilise and organise and create change really began. And so I think my work and both my lived experience as a Black Muslim woman has taught me something really uncomfortable but also very important, and that is that participation itself doesn't automatically empower, right? So, it's a buzzword, it's used a lot, but it can actually cause a lot of harm. So when it's misused, it can harm the communities that we claim to value. It can also exhaust them. So I do have my notes with me, and I'm neurodiverse, so I'm going to need these, otherwise I'll start talking about everything I hate. Today what I want to talk about is participation fatigue. Obviously that's the topic. I want to talk about how it emerges, how it harms communities, and what it looked like when it showed up in my own research project with a group of British Muslim women. So I've decided to switch the slides around sort of last minute, so I thought I'd spice it up. And I'm going to start with this slide rather than the other one, and I'll move backwards. So this is a photo of the group of Muslim women, some of them. There were 16 in total. This is some of them. This was during one of the workshops. So we did, it was a participatory project using photo voice. We met at the mosque and community centre, so I decided very early on that there were things that I knew as a member of that community that needed to be in place before it even began. So rather than using my university, which I had access to, it didn't have prayer facilities, and I knew that the women would want to and need to pray. So I reached out to a community organisation. They were really happy to give us the space. I also applied for funding. I was like, this is going to cost their time, transport, all that sort of stuff, or whatever we want to do as the eventual outcome, which ended up being photo voice and using images to sort of tell our story. And I say our because I took part both as a researcher but as a co-researcher and a participant in the project. But I applied for some money and I ended up getting £4,000, which we then decided as a group how we're going to spend that budget. So I sort of put some things in place. And another thing, childcare, there wasn't childcare access at my institution, so that allowed for women who needed to bring their children along. So there's all these kind of things that I thought about prior to beginning the project. Onto this slide. The project was called Reclaiming Our Narrative. And I want to bring it to life, what participation fatigue looked like by starting with this. And these women were really brilliant. They were fantastic, talented. We had a range, so they were aged between 29 to 69. We had African, Caribbean, Arab and South Asian Muslim women, some that wore hijab, as you can see, and some that didn't. And that was really deliberate on my part. I wanted it to kind of represent the community and be reflective of what the Muslim community looks like in the UK. And that's not always captured. So we're smiling there, we're very happy eating and drinking and brainstorming. We've got a flip chart behind us, but it wasn't always like that. There was a lot of conflict as well when we're talking about sensitive topics. So it really did challenge me. But yeah, they were really brilliant Muslim women. But I think the key point here is that they are one of the most over-researched and mis-researched groups in the UK. And so that showed up very early on, actually in our first workshop, because when we began, their frustration was quite visible. And when I asked what they thought about research involving Muslim women, their responses were immediate and it was brutally honest. So I'm going to read out some quotes from my thesis and a paper that I published. So one of the women, these are pseudonyms, one of the women called Shamsa said, "It's always cherry-picked research, it's not representative, and it's not meaningful." Sarah, one of the women, also talked about researchers arriving with the why, always predetermined, so deciding why they're doing the research, which shapes the outcomes before anything even begins. And Nasreen described it perfectly. She said, "It feels like you're being led through a carefully managed maze by the researcher." And so that's why I've got the image of the maze there. And the whole group agreed with her, everybody nodded, everybody was in agreement, even those that didn't voice their opinion about it, were all kind of collectively of the opinion that the research it's not centering sort of the community's voices and what matters to them, it's about the researchers' agendas. And I didn't necessarily disagree with that. And then came what I'd like to call, and the title of this talk, which is Not Another Hijab Question Moment. And when I mentioned sort of the hijab trends and modest fashion, that was the focus of the PhD project that I started. Their reaction was instant.
Put the screen up.
I'll do you. Okay, thank you. So their reaction to my mentioning the hijab was instant. There was laughter, there was sighs, and there was like a collective, "Hannah, please, not this again, not this topic again." And one of the women called Zara asked a really important question. She asked, "Why do we need to discuss the hijab more than every other important thing in life, And I think that's a key thing. There's so many important topics that this community wants to discuss, wants to focus on over the hijab, which, is a piece of cloth. But my daughter did, when I was, preparing and sharing it with her earlier, she did point out, actually, Mama, it's not just a piece of cloth. And that's true, because she said, I disagree with you. Because it has a lot more meaning than that, right? So the people that wear it, it's not something like a belt. It has a lot of meaning. People wear it for different reasons. It's their belief, it's their, modesty and so on. But literally, it's a piece of fabric. But what I was witnessing from the women, one of them also said, our modesty is always confused with oppression. And what they were doing was not disengaging, but it was just research fatigue. They were fed up, they were bored, they're frustrated, and their emotional labour all produced by repeatedly being positioned through a very small, narrow lens. And I think this moment became really powerful and pivotal in the project, because by rejecting the hijab topic, that was the group's first collective act of agency. And the moment where they, kind of decided and said, this project's not going to be what others have made it. It's going to be what we decide matters, or it's pointless calling it art. And they're absolutely correct. And this participation fatigue was also the beginning of the Reclaiming Our Narrative project, which they named, it's collective power. So how it shows up, go back please. So what they express so clearly is exactly what it looks like more broadly across other communities. So this isn't just specific to Muslim communities, it happens across communities, and it can be withdrawal. So withdrawing, we're done talking about this, we don't want to talk about this anymore. And it doesn't mean that there's a lack of interest. It's a protective response, and it's a protective response to repeated extraction, of those communities. And underneath that is something deeper. It indicates a totally understandable cynicism about whether participation will lead anywhere at all. And suspicion becomes the default. They're always sort of questioning, what is the catch? Who is this work really for? And that's what I'm seeing more asking me as the researcher, is this for us or is it for you? And when people have been over-consulted and underserved, suspicion is logical. And it also shows up through frustration at being invited to the room, to the seat at the table, but not into the decisions, like you both kind of mentioned as well. And that's tokenism at its finest. So being asked to speak but never really being heard, being represented but also misrepresented. And for many communities, engagement comes with emotional labour, the retelling of stories that include trauma, explaining of identity, and correcting assumptions, checking how one's coming across again and again and again and again. And over time that erodes trust, not just in individual researchers like myself, but in institutions and systems that refuse to change, and even the very idea of participation itself. So the Muslim women in the project were naming something far bigger than their individual experiences. They're naming a pattern, and in academia we love a pattern, right? So this pattern shows up anywhere where participation becomes a huge burden instead of a benefit for those communities. And there's a lot of research that shows that, or it describes how people reject engagement because they feel intruded upon, they don't see the relevance of the project or the topics, or they don't see the usefulness of the outcomes. And it carries a lot of cost, like you mentioned. It carries emotional labour. There's language barriers. There might be lack of childcare, lack of transport, fear of consequences, fear of political violence, or some other repercussions, and the unequal power dynamics that show up. So in order to participate, people have to feel safe, they have to feel valued, they have to feel supported. And so to sum up, participatory fatigue isn't just one thing, it's an accumulation of mistrust, unmet expectations, practical barriers, and an ongoing feeling that communities are giving far more than they receive. Okay, so the final slide, and I'm not going to go through all these definitions, don't worry, just wanted to show kind of the different ways that there are a lot of participatory research approaches out there, and you might have heard of some of them. Does some of them sound or look familiar? Yeah? So not everything can be or should be participatory, and one thing I want to leave you with is this. Participation is very powerful. I think we all understand that, the power of it, its potential, but only when it's honest and it's transparent, right? So not everything can be participatory, and pretending otherwise, which happens in a lot of institutions, I see it all the time, just creates mistrust. Transparency about the limits and parameters is important. I think it's key from the get-go. Say what's possible and what isn't. And care for the emotional and practical cost of engagement. That's another key thing. People shouldn't have to do things for free. The researchers certainly are. And genuine reciprocity matters more than the labels. So it's a structural failure from my perspective. And one of the challenges, and I know you've said this as well, is that it's a buzzword. So the term gets used everywhere. You keep hearing it, community engagement, participation, and often without the power sharing that it implies. So I'm not going to unpack any of this tonight because we don't have time. And the issue I want to highlight isn't the variety of methods, it's what happens when participatory research becomes co-opted by institutions who really couldn't get it down. And rather than it being about genuine ethical practice, and that's what fuels participation fatigue. So the final point I want to make is that communities are tired of participating in processes that don't change anything, and being asked the same questions in the same ways with the same outcomes. If we can't shift power, then at least what we can do is shift the conversations And as the ladies in my project emphasised, we can start with not asking yet another hijab question. Thank you, everyone.